Today we will be looking into two prominent figures in the civil rights movement. Our group will discuss these gentlemen's lives and how they were assassinated. We will start with Malcolm X, and then we'll cover Medgar Evers' life second. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. His mother, Louise Norton Little, was a homemaker occupied with the family's 8 children. His father, Earl Little, was an outspoken Baptist minister and also an avid supporter of black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey. Earl's civil rights activism prompted death threats from the white supremacist organization, the Black Legion, forcing the family to relocate twice before Malcolm's 4th birthday. In 1925, their Michigan home was burned to the ground. 2 years later, Irby's body was found laying across the town's trolley tracks. Police ruled that both incidents as accidents, but the Littles were very certain that members of the Black Legion were responsible for his death. Louise suffered emotional breakdown several years after the death of her husband and was committed to a mental institution. Her children were split up amongst various foster homes and orphanages. Later on in life, Malcolm and his buddy, Malcolm Shorty Jarvis, moved back to Boston. In 1946, they were arrested and convicted on burglary charges, and Malcolm was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was paroled after 7 years. Recalling in his days of school, he used his prison time to further his education. It was during this period of self-alignment that Malcolm's brother, Reginald, would visit and discuss his recent conversion to the Muslim religion. Reginald belonged to the religious organization of the Nation of Islam, also known as NOI. Intrigued, Malcolm began to study the teachings of the NOI leader, Elijah Muhammad. Muhammad taught that the white society actively worked to keep African Americans from empowering themselves and achieving political power, economic power, or social success. Among other goals, the NOI fought for a state of their own, separate from one inhabited by white people. By the time he was paroled in 1952, Malcolm was a devoted follower with a new surname, X. He considered Little as a slave name and chose X to signify his lost tribal name. Intelligent and articulate, Malcolm was appointed as a minister and national spokesman for the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad also charged him with establishing new mosques in cities such as Detroit, Michigan, and Harlem, New York. Malcolm utilized newspaper columns as well as radio and television to communicate the NOI's message across the United States. His charisma, drive, and conviction attracted an astounding number of new members. Malcolm was largely credited with the increased membership in the NOIs, from 500 in 1952 to 30,000 plus in 1963. Since joining the NOI, Malcolm had strictly adhered to the teachings of Muhammad, which included remaining celibate until his marriage to Betty Shabazz in 1958. Malcolm's faith was dealt a crushing blow at the height of the Civil Rights Movement in 1963. He learned that his mentor and leader, Elijah Muhammad, was secretly having relations with as many as 6 women within the Nation of Islam's organization. As if that were not enough, Malcolm found out that some of the relations had fostered children. Malcolm refused Muhammad's request to help cover up the affairs and subsequent children. He was deeply hurt by the deception of Muhammad, whom he had considered a living prophet at this time. Malcolm also felt guilty about the masses he had led to join the NOI, which he now felt were a fraudulent organization built on top of too many lies to ignore. Same year, 1964, Malcolm went on a pilgrimage to Mecca, Saudi Arabia. The trip proved life-altering. For the first time, Malcolm shared his thoughts and beliefs with different cultures, and found the response to be overwhelmingly positive. When he returned, Malcolm said he had met a blonde-haired, blue-eyed man that I could actually call my brother. He returned to the United States with a new outlook on integration and a new hope for the future. This time when Malcolm spoke, instead of just preaching to African Americans, he had a message for all races. After Malcolm resigned from his position with the Nation of Islam and renounced Elijah Muhammad, relations between the two had become increasingly volatile. FBI informants working undercover in the NOI warned officials that Malcolm had been marked for assassination.
Malcolm X was assassinated on February 21, 1965, while preparing to address the Organization of Afro-American Unity in one of Manhattan's ballroom. There was about 400 people that attended this event when a dispute broke out, and the bodyguard stepped in to settle the dispute. When this happened, the man from the front row rushed to the stage and shot a double-barreled shotgun into Malcolm X's chest, closely followed by two other gunmen firing semi-auto handguns at him. He died shortly after arriving at Columbian Presbyterian Hospital around 3:30 p.m. In total, he suffered 21 gunshot wounds across his body. Shortly after the shooting, the crowd subdued Thomas Hagen, one of the gunmen who was beaten before the police had arrived. With the help of eyewitness account, the police also arrested Norman Butler and Thomas Johnson for the murder of Malcolm X. Hagen was the only one who pleaded guilty to the murder charge. The two others maintained that they were innocent to this very day. His funeral was held on February 27th at Faith Temple of Christ of God in Christ. The church was filled to capacity and loudspeakers were set up to broadcast the funeral to the overflow crowd outside the church. Local TV station also broadcast his funeral live. He was laid to rest in the Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York. The reaction to Malcolm X's death was varied in the public, but the general tone was that we have lost someone who was a brilliant person, though his ways to achieve his goals were unorthodox. But nonetheless, it was a tragic loss. The international press also published a story about his death, such as the Daily Times of Nigeria or Guangming Daily, a Chinese newspaper. There is a major conspiracy about his death. It was who was at fault for his death. People blamed NYPD, the FBI, or for the lack of police protection on that day. To this day, there isn't a definite answer for who or whom actually plotted this assassination.
Though Malcolm X was a prominent figure from the North, Medgar Evers was strongly supportive in representing the Southern states.
In the early morning of June 12, 1963, just hours after President Kennedy's speech on national television in support of civil rights, Evers pulled into his driveway after returning from a meeting with NAACP lawyers and carrying T-shirts that stated "Jim Crow must go." Evers was struck in the back with a bullet that ricocheted into his house. He staggered 30 feet before collapsing and later died at a local hospital 50 minutes later. Evers' lengthy list of civil rights fights and victories made him a target for militant white supremacists. More nationally, Evers was buried on June 19 in Arlington National Cemetery and received full military honors in front of a crowd of more than 3,000 people. The national outrage over Evers' murder increased support for legislation that would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The act was committed by Byron D. Beckwith, a white supremacist and Klansman. However, two white witnesses, both white policemen, claimed to have seen the KKK member in Greenwood, Mississippi, 60 miles away from the crime scene. He was charged on June 21, 1963, facing all-male white juries that twice resulted in hung juries while trying to determine the outcome. In 1989, the question of Beckwith's guilt was again raised when a Jackson newspaper published the accounts of the files of the now-defunct Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, an organization that existed during the 1950s to help raise popular support for the maintenance of segregation. The accounts showed that the commission had helped lawyers for Beckwith screen potential jurors during the first two trials, but County District Attorney's Office found no evidence of such jury tampering, but did locate a number of new witnesses, including several individuals who would eventually testify that Beckwith had bragged to them about the murder. Assistant District Attorney Bobby DeLauder took on the case despite the obstacles of lost evidence and limited public support. A third murder trial commenced in Jackson in late January 1994, and Beckwith was brought to trial based on new evidence, and the alibi testimony of those officers was called into question. During the trial, the body of Evers was exhumed from his grave for an autopsy and found to be in a surprisingly excellent state of preservation as a result of embalming. And a racially mixed jury composed of residents of Hinds County, Mississippi, found Beckwith guilty of murder on February 5, 1994, after having lived as a free man for as much as 3 decades following the killing. Byron D. Beckwith appealed unsuccessfully and died at age 80 in prison in January 2001. After Beckwith's conviction, families began to see the possibilities that justice might still be possible in other killings even after 3 decades. The conviction in Jackson prompted authorities elsewhere to look again at other crimes of the past. Talk of opening these cases also inspired authorities in Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida.